This is Getting On with Life, Biblical Wisdom for Successful Christian Living. And this lesson is Grace Breaks Through. A friend recounted with me a few days ago how he had struggled during a very challenging time in recent years. He had a great burden to bear and struggled against his fears, insecurities, uncertainties, and so on. He mentioned in passing that at a certain point his pastor's help hit home, and he was suddenly wonderfully free from all anxiety, stress, and burden. That was only one step in a long journey, but it struck me that there are those special moments when God's grace breaks through. Over the decades of my life, I have at times been burdened with guilt, shame, insecurity, fears, anxieties, and so on. When I took those things to God, I was able to overcome all that weighed me down. Those were times when grace broke through. All that was brought home to me quite clearly last night as I faced yet another challenge. I became increasingly frustrated at some ongoing pressures. Several people kept making demands on my time, expecting me to be on hand to serve their supposed needs, while I had other things as priorities. Phone calls and unexpected demands had loaded me down over several weeks. Yesterday seemed to be a breaking point. I reacted to someone whose expectations were unwarranted, and their expectation that I be on hand just to serve their whims really annoyed me. I had every right to push back and to resist being treated with disrespect, but what bothered me most was my internal agitation. I felt a mixture of being offended, annoyed, frustrated, and fed up. That feeling stayed with me for several hours, and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. Late that night, I suddenly lit on the wonder of God's grace. People are annoying, and I am weak and frustrated, but God's grace is not damaged or overcome. I remembered that I can choose whether to wallow in discomfort and frustration or apply God's grace. I chose to call on God's grace. As I did, my internal discomfort dissolved, and I was free from the disturbance gnawing inside me. I felt like my empty tank had been filled, and that my capacity to keep going and keep helping people who kept putting things on me was renewed. I felt restored. I had imbibed grace. I had drawn from the well of salvation. Hebrews 4:16 tells us, "Come boldly to the throne of grace to obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." And 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you." And Isaiah 12:3 adds, "Therefore with joy will you draw water from the wells of salvation." That's what my friend had been talking about a few days ago, that moment when God's grace breaks through and all that was unbearable dissolves in the presence of God's amazing love and care. The problems may not disappear, but the burden those problems put on us is lifted. We have strength and endurance to get on with life without feeling overwhelmed. This is particularly important when it comes to dealing with people. We need God's grace to enable us to keep going, but we need to give grace to others as well. If we have not received God's grace, we will be buried in our discomfort. We won't be able to give grace to others since we will resent or react to them. When we receive God's grace and our own internal reactions are quelled, we are empowered to give grace to others. If we don't find God's grace, we will likely become more and more reactive to those who annoy us, and bitterness will grow in our lives toward them and others. Note the serious warning about making sure you employ God's grace. Hebrews 12:15 says, "Be careful to always find God's grace, or a root of bitterness will spring up and trouble you, and it will defile many." When you are frustrated or annoyed with people, you are on the road to bitterness. If you don't find God's grace for yourself, committing the problems to God and finding God's peace and wisdom, you will not be able to give grace to those who offend you. If you don't find that grace, then you continue on the road to bitterness. Once bitterness is in your life, you'll be sour and unkind in all kinds of situations, causing offense to many of those around you. Those bitter older people you meet from time to time weren't like that as children, but along the way they allowed themselves to be resentful, unforgiving, annoyed, hurt, and the like, and they did not find God's grace for themselves or for those who offend them. Let me encourage you that God has provided wonderful release for you when you turn to Him for His grace, instead of nursing all your frustrations and offenses. And let me encourage you that you can dissolve the annoyed feelings you have toward others when you apply God's grace to them. Ask yourself if you are perfect, or if you actually have faults and need to be forgiven at times. If God has to forgive you and put up with your foolish and petty ideas, isn't it right that you show the same grace to others? I urge you to bring God's grace right now into all those areas where you feel offended, wronged, annoyed, frustrated, and the like. Call on God's grace to drain all your unhappy feelings from you. Then give grace to those who make problems for you. Bless them, and ask God to set them free too. As you do that, you can begin collecting your own wonderful testimonies of how amazing it is when grace breaks through. God bless you.